Poon Lim. In 1942, Poon Lim was working as a steward on a British merchant ship called the SS Ben Lomond, which was just unlucky enough to get torpedoed by a German U-boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the crew went down with the ship because lifeboats were more of a suggestion than a requirement back then. Lim, being one of the few lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, survivors, managed to grab a life vest and swim his way to a small wooden raft floating in the chaos. The raft was stocked with some emergency supplies like biscuits, a water jug, and a flashlight, which sounds great until you realize that's all he had for what would turn into a 133-day floating nightmare. With no GPS, no flares, and no Wi-Fi, Lim was left drifting around, waiting for rescue or death, whichever showed up first. As the biscuits and water ran out, Lim had to get creative. He caught fish with a piece of wire from the flashlight and managed to collect rainwater during storms. Brilliant move, had it been raining every day, which it wasn't. When he couldn't catch fish, he ate the seagulls that got too curious about his raft. Yes, seagulls. He used one of them to catch even bigger fish by gutting it and tossing it back into the water as bait. When the sharks started circling, instead of panicking, he killed one with a jug of water and then ate it raw. Meanwhile, ships passed him by multiple times without stopping, probably assuming he was just a very determined fisherman or a hallucination. Lim even had to deal with sunburn, dehydration, and saltwater sores while rationing what little food he had left. Somehow, he kept going. On April 5, 1943, after 133 days of floating around like a human cork, Lim's raft finally drifted close enough to Brazil for some fishermen to spot him. By that point, he had lost a ton of weight, his body was covered in sores, and as the script sang it, still alive but barely breathing. He was taken to a hospital, where doctors were probably amazed that he hadn't turned into beef jerky by then. Lim eventually moved to the United States, where he lived a quieter life. Gene Hilliard. In late December 1980, a 19-year-old Gene Hilliard from rural Minnesota had driven on a very cold night and soon got stuck when her car refused to move any farther. So she got out and walked toward a friend's farmhouse through deep snow under sub-zero weather for miles, eventually dropping face first into the icy ground and staying there stiff and unmoving for around 6 hours while dressed in ordinary winter clothes. Each minute that passed, she slowly gave the cold shoulder to the world. By dawn, she basically looked like this, except she was on the ground and she was covered in snow almost. When a friend found her body at sunrise, he dragged her frozen form into a vehicle and raced to the nearest small hospital where the doctors could not even measure a normal body temperature. They saw her limbs were as solid as wooden boards, so they covered her in electric heating pads and warm blankets and handled her stiff arms and legs quietly. They also gave her intravenous fluids that were warmed up, noting that her face and body were pale and covered in frost. After a few hours of patient work, her eyelids started to move and her body temperature began to rise. Her fingers and toes returned to a normal color as soon as she started to talk a bit, although her speech was slow. But then the medical staff realized the frost had not caused any permanent damage. So they watched her regain control of her muscles and eventually sit upright, showing no big injuries to her vital organs and not even major frostbite on her skin. Within a short period, her improvement kept going until she was able to walk around and recover fully. No scars or broken bones, no hearing loss or vision problem. The researchers assumed that she survived because she was a healthy young woman, but it wasn't really studied that much. I mean, understandable that she'd refuse. She almost died, possibly even won for a couple of minutes or hours. Douglas Mawson. Dougie Boy and his team set off on an Antarctic expedition in 1911. You know, back when maps still had blank spaces, and people thought it was a great idea to walk into the most inhospitable place on Earth with wool coats and canned food. Mawson, a geologist by trade, teamed up with two others, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz. They were tasked with gathering data from the uncharted east coast of Antarctica. Things went south fast, with pun fully intended, when Ninnis fell into a crevasse along with most of their supplies. That left Mawson and Mertz to fend for themselves with barely any food, just a sled, and the soul-crushing realization that they were about as close to civilization as you are to the moon. They started eating their sled dogs to survive, which is both horrifying and probably not the worst meal plan of that trip. And hey ho, what do you know? Dog meat is not great for your health. By the time Mertz died, because this is Antarctica, Mawson was on his own. His body was shutting down. Name a random part of the body, and it's probably frozen for him. His skin was peeling off in sheets from what was probably a combination of starvation and the effects of eating the liver of their sled dogs, which poisoned him with too much vitamin A. Good times all around. Mawson still had hundreds of miles to cover to get back to base camp. At one point, he fell into a crevasse himself but managed to climb out. He patched himself up with whatever he could find, like a tape to hold the soles of his boots together. He looked like a walking disaster, and smelled like one too, if we're being honest. When Mawson finally crawled back to base camp, he found out that the ship that was supposed to take them home had left a few hours earlier. Perfect timing. Luckily for him, a few guys had stayed behind. They patched him up while probably wondering how on earth this guy was still alive. Mawson eventually made it back to Australia, where he became a national hero. He lived to be 76. Angela Hernandez. Angela was just living her life on a road trip down the California coast in July 2018, probably saying something like, "Ah, the open road, what could possibly go wrong?" Then out of nowhere, her car went yeeting off a cliff in Big Sur, California. Without her consent, of course. And before she knew it, she was plummeting 250 feet straight into rocky oblivion. Now, any normal person would have ended right there with a game over screen popping up, but Angela was no ordinary human. I mean, she probably was. The circumstances and constellations in the sky probably just aligned in her favor. I don't know. She crawled out of the wreckage with a shoulder that probably looked like a modern art sculpture, and a brain that got tossed around in her skull like dice in a gambler's cup. Yet, there she was alive, stranded and in the middle of a beach where it's easier to find selfie-taking tourists than fresh drinking water. But surprise, no tourists today. For 7 days, she basically turned into a survival game character. She drank water trickling from mossy rocks, found a radiator hose from her Jeep to siphon tiny droplets. She even scavenged whatever little edible item she could find. As each day passed, Angela's body must have felt like it was on a permanent vacation in whatever place it hurt. She had a broken collarbone saying, "Ow," lungs full of salty air, brain still trying to figure out what in the mother of nature just happened, and no help in sight. Still, Angela knew how to keep her cool. Maybe she had moments of screaming at the sky or cursing at that small animal that supposedly made her swerve in the first place, but she didn't give up. After a week of playing Castaway minus the volleyball friend, she was finally spotted by 2 hikers who stumbled upon her the way you'd trip over a misplaced Lego block. They alerted rescuers, and before you know it, Angela Hernandez was pulled out of her real-life action movie set and rushed to safety. Ada Blackjack. Ada Blackjack was a young woman from Nome, Alaska, who didn't start her life aiming to become some kind of Arctic survival legend. But that's exactly what happened when she got roped into a disastrous expedition to Wrangel Island in 1921. She was hired as a seamstress for the team, mostly because she was one of the few locals desperate enough to sign up for a mission led by a man named Vilhjalmur Stephenson, who, by some sort of travel agency issues, didn't even go with them. Instead, he sent 5 people to claim the uninhabited island for Canada. You can already tell this was a great idea. Once there, things fell apart as fast as Titanic. The supplies they brought were gone in no time. Hunting wasn't even possible as well, because none of these guys knew what they were doing. Ada was stuck cleaning up their messes and stitching up their clothes while they all started to starve. Eventually, the men made a brilliant plan to leave Ada and one sick teammate behind while they went off to get help. And with another travel agency issue, they never came back. She was left alone with one sick teammate. When he eventually died, she was on her own. For 2 whole years, she survived in the Arctic wilderness. She hunted seals, which, fun fact, is not as glamorous as it sounds. It's bloody, exhausting, and also your only option when you're freezing and starving to death. She also built makeshift shelters, kept a journal, and dealt with polar bears. One bear even tried to break into her camp, but she scared it off, proving that even apex predators know when not to mess with someone having a worse day than them. By the time a rescue team finally showed up, Ada was alive, though barely. She didn't exactly get a hero's welcome. The men who died were treated like martyrs, and Ada for some reason got blamed for not doing more to save them. After the whole Wrangel Island thing, Ada went back to Nome and tried to live a normal life. She spent the rest of her days taking care of her disabled son, quietly dealing with the trauma of her 2-year solo survival stint, and probably wondering why people were so terrible at giving her the credit she deserved. The expedition that made her name also haunted her, because let's face it, you don't spend 2 years eating seals and fighting polar bears without it leaving a mark. Yosi Ginsburg. Yosi Ginsburg was a 22-year-old Israeli backpacker who thought it was a good idea to explore uncharted areas of the Bolivian Amazon in 1981 with 3 guys he barely knew, a Swiss teacher named Marcus Stamm, an American photographer Kevin Gale, and an Austrian guy Karl Ruprechter, who claimed to be an experienced guide. Turns out, Karl's experience turned out to be as real as a $3 bill. After trekking through the jungle for days, the group started falling apart. Marcus was struggling with a trench foot. Kevin wanted to keep moving, and Yosi was stuck in the middle of it. They eventually split into two pairs. Yosi and Kevin attempted to navigate the Tweechy River on a makeshift raft, while Carl and Marcus decided to hike back to civilization. The raft plan worked great until it didn't. The river currents were unforgiving, and Yosi got thrown overboard and separated from Kevin, leaving him stranded alone in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Yosi had no survival training, no food, and no clue how to get out of the jungle. He lived off whatever he could find: fruits, raw eggs, and even a few monkeys that he managed to scare off from their own food. He drank filthy water, got swarmed by insects, and suffered constant hunger and exhaustion. At one point, he sank into a swamp and had to claw his way out, covered in leeches. He also got bitten by a snake. Infection set in, and his skin started peeling off. Despite this carnival of horrors, Yosi kept moving. Every night, he had to deal with the jungle's soundtrack: howling monkeys, hissing snakes, and some other songs from the Jungle Book. It's a miracle he didn't lose his mind completely, or maybe he did, considering he started hallucinating about a beautiful woman guiding him to safety. Eventually, Kevin made it back to civilization and raised the alarm. A search party was launched, and after 3 weeks of Yosi stumbling around like a malnourished Tarzan, he was found by a group of locals who pulled him out of the jungle. He was covered in sores, weighed about as much as a sack of potatoes, and looked like death warmed over. But he was alive. Yosi went on to write a book about his field trip, Jungle. It became a bestseller and was later turned into a movie starring Daniel Radcliffe. He also turned his brush with death into a career, becoming a motivational speaker. Ralston. Ralston was a guy who thought a solo hiking trip in Utah's Blue John Canyon was a great idea. On April 26, 2003, he made one small miscalculation. He forgot that nature doesn't care. While navigating a narrow slot canyon, an 800-pound boulder shifted and pinned his right arm against the wall. That's right, stuck in the middle of nowhere with no one around to hear him scream. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, which is a rookie mistake for someone who supposedly knew the outdoors. For the next 5 days, 127 hours, if you're into exact numbers, he rationed his water, which was barely a liter, and nibbled on whatever scraps of food he had left. He tried chipping away at the boulder with a dull multi-tool that could barely cut paper, let alone move a massive rock. It didn't work. Dehydrated and hallucinating, he started carving his name and date of birth on the canyon wall, prepping for the worst-case scenario. By the 6th day, Ralston realized no one was coming to save him. He also realized his arm was not coming out from under that boulder. So, like a guy who's watched way too many survival shows, he did the unthinkable. Using the same cheap multi-tool that couldn't even handle the boulder, he amputated his own arm. And before you ask, no, it wasn't quick or painless. He first had to break his radius and ulna bones, and then use the tool's dull blade to cut through skin, muscle, and nerves. If that wasn't enough, he had to make it through his tendons and finish up with his artery to avoid bleeding out. It took him over an hour to perform this amateur surgery. Once free, he wrapped what was left of his arm in a makeshift tourniquet, climbed out of the canyon, and hiked 6 miles to find help. 6 miles, with one arm, and blood loss that should have turned him into a human raisin. Luckily, a Dutch family on vacation found him, and a helicopter eventually airlifted him to a hospital. Ralston survived, but his right arm was gone. Hollywood even turned his thing into a movie, 127 Hours, with James Franco playing him. Louis Zamperini. The man started as an Olympic runner, earning fame in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, but he joined the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II. In 1943, during a search mission in the Pacific, his B-24 bomber malfunctioned and crashed into the ocean. Out of the 11 crew members, only 3 survived the impact. Of course, Louis was one of them. He wouldn't be in this video otherwise. They drifted on 2 inflatable rafts in shark-infested waters, rationing the few provisions they had. Hunger, dehydration, and exposure to the elements pushed them to their limits. To survive, they caught fish and birds with their bare hands, and even drank rainwater whenever they were lucky enough to get it. After 33 days, one of the men died. The remaining 2 continued to endure, warding off sharks that tried to jump into the raft and dodging bullets from passing Japanese planes. By the 47th day, they were emaciated, barely alive, and over 2,000 miles from the crash site. When Zamperini and Phillips were finally rescued, it wasn't much of a relief. A Japanese patrol boat picked them up, and they were taken as prisoners of war. Part 2 of the survival. Zamperini was sent to various POW camps where conditions were beyond inhumane. He was starved, beaten up, and asked to work for nothing. One of the most brutal guards, known to prisoners as the Bird, singled him out for particularly sadistic treatment. I wonder why the Bird did that. I'll answer myself. It's because Lewis was an Olympian. The guards made it a game to beat him, humiliate him, and break his spirit. Starvation continued as the daily rations barely kept them alive, and diseases ran rampant. Despite this, Zamperini somehow survived multiple years of captivity. The war ended in 1945, and the camp was liberated. Zamperini returned to the United States as a war hero. Physically, he was a shell of his former self, and mentally, he was haunted by what he had endured. Nightmares of the bird and his time as a prisoner plagued him. Struggling to adjust to normal life, he turned to alcohol to cope with the trauma. It nearly destroyed him until a chance encounter with a spiritual awakening gave him a path to recovery. He later forgave his captors, including the bird, in a move that people would describe as inspiring, though it's hard to ignore the absurdity of forgiving someone who made your life a living hell. Mauro Prosperi. Mauro Prosperi was an Italian police officer and an ultra-marathon runner who in 1994 joined the Marathon des Sables. It was a 6-day, 156-mile race across the Moroccan Sahara. The event was already infamous for pushing athletes to the brink, but my guy Mauro ended up in a league of his own. Midway through the race, a violent sandstorm hit. Organizers warned runners to hunker down, but he was channeling his inner Mad Max, so he pressed on, figuring he could power through. What amazing things the human body can go through if they set their minds to it, no? By the way, he couldn't power through. The storm lasted 8 hours, and when it cleared, he was hopelessly off course. Armed with a limited supply of food and water, he wandered into a part of the desert where, ironically, even the scorpions seemed to be on vacation. Within days, dehydration set in. Ever the survivalist, he started drinking his own piss. When that didn't cut it, he stumbled into an abandoned Muslim shrine, and in an act that probably had Bear Grylls applauding from the future, caught and ate bats. Even wilder, he went full-on Drac by drinking their blood for hydration. Prosperi reportedly used his skills as a former pentathlon athlete to catch the bats. As the days dragged on, Prosperi tried signaling for help, lighting fires and writing SOS messages in the sand, but the Sahara wasn't interested. At one point, convinced his luck had run out, he attempted to do a Hannah Baker move, you know, KMS, but on the outstanding thickening of the plot, and his blood, the extreme dehydration thickened his blood to the point that he didn't bleed out. If there's a more on-the-nose metaphor for the Sahara's cruelty, I haven't heard it. Realizing that was his second life, he moved again, covering about 180 miles total over the course of 9 days. Along the way, he ate whatever wildlife he could find. It finally ended when he stumbled upon a group of nomads who took one look at the walking skeleton in running shoes and rushed him to an Algerian hospital. By the time he was rescued, Prosperi had lost 40 pounds and was suffering from severe organ damage. But hey, at least he got out alive, something his bats couldn't say. After he recovered, Mauro ritornato in Italia. He became a public speaker, telling everyone to realistically pick their battles. Peter Skyllberg. Peter in 2011 was under depression and massive debt. He ended up in a snowbank after his car slid off the road. You'd think nature would cut him some slack, but nope. A snowstorm buried his vehicle under thick layers of ice and snow, effectively trapping him. The temperatures outside dropped to below freezing, negative 30 degrees Celsius. Inside his car, it wasn't exactly tropical either, but at least it shielded him from the wind. Skyllberg's diet for the next 2 months was something out of a Dean Martin song, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow. Just snow. His car was basically a metallic igloo, and his only source of heat was his body. Experts later speculated that his car acted as an insulator, creating a microclimate that was barely above freezing. Lucky for him, he had a sleeping bag. Unlucky for him, he didn't have anything resembling real food. Imagine being snowed in with nothing but ice and existential dread. By the time February 2012 rolled around, Skyllberg's car was discovered by a passing snowmobiler. The rescuer probably expected to find a popsicle, not a living, breathing man. When emergency responders arrived, they found Skyllberg standing on the thread that says death and life on either side. He had survived an estimated 60 days in temperatures that could make a polar bear shiver, with zero nutrition. Some scientists suggested his body had entered a hibernation-like state, slowing down his metabolism to conserve energy. Others pointed to his pre-snowbank body weight. He had some extra pounds going in, and those reserves probably saved him. If this sounds like something straight out of Game of Thrones, you're not far off. The man was practically a human White Walker at this point. He was airlifted to a hospital where he received treatment for hypothermia and malnutrition. After this, he stayed away from the media, who called him the Swedish snowman. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates were two climbers with a death wish. Or at least that's what it looked like when they tackled Ciudad Grande in the Andes in 1985. At 20,814 feet, it was not exactly the place for a casual stroll. They were climbing the west face, a route no one else had been daredevil enough to try before. Things started off well. They reached the summit in 3 days, which was honestly the only easy part. On the descent, Simpson broke his leg. which in climbing terms is pretty much a death sentence. Yates tried to lower him down using ropes, inch by agonizing inch. At one point, though, the terrain left Yates hanging there like Gwen when Peter failed to save her, holding on to Simpson with no way to move. After an hour of this, Yates did the thing that made him infamous. He cut the rope. Simpson fell into a crevasse. Yates thought his partner was cooked and made his way back to camp, but Joe was alive. He crawled out of it on all fours. After falling into the crevasse, he landed on a ledge instead of falling all the way to the bottom. His options were to either stay and die or go deeper and look for an exit. He chose to go all in, and this is one of the times a human becomes scary, when they have nothing to lose. But their lives, of course. He found a way out and began a 3-day crawl back to base camp. Dragging his shattered leg through ice and rocks, Simpson was running on nothing but adrenaline. He was severely dehydrated, starving, and losing blood. But somehow, he covered miles of treacherous terrain even as his body was breaking down. When he finally reached base camp, Yates was still there, shocked that Simpson had managed to survive the crawl from hell. "Why the heck did you cut the rope?" "Dude, I didn't have a choice. I really thought you had no hope there. Even other climbers would agree that I was in the right. Did you know that I had to crawl miles like I was a cocoa melon baby? I'm suing the heck out of you." He didn't, but Simon got dragged through the court of public opinion for cutting the rope, even though most climbers agreed he'd had no choice. Joe, on the other hand, wrote a book called Touching the Void. The book became a bestseller, and the story turned into a documentary years later. Both men kept climbing. As for my own limit of survival, it's from the bed to the couch. They're both in the same room. See y'all.